Chapter 1 Freedom and Freud's Theory of Instincts. A discussion of Freudian theory from the standpoint of political science and philosophy requires some justification, in part because Freud repeatedly emphasized the scientific and empirical character of his work. The justification must be twofold. First, it must show that the structure of Freudian theory is open to and in fact encourages consideration in political terms, that this theory, which appears to be purely biological, is fundamentally social and historical. Second, it must show on the one hand to what extent psychology today is an essential part of political science, and on the other hand to what extent the Freudian theory of instincts, which is the only thing we will be concerned with here, makes it possible to understand the hidden nature of certain decisive tendencies in current politics. We will begin with the second aspect of the justification. Our concern is not with introducing psychological concepts into political science or with explaining political processes in psychological terms. That would mean attempting to explain what is basic in terms of what is based on it. Rather, psychology in its inner structure must reveal itself to be political. The psyche appears more and more immediately to be a piece of the social totality, so that individuation is almost synonymous with apathy and even with guilt, but also with the principle of negation, of possible revolution. Moreover, the totality of which the psyche is a part becomes to an increasing extent less society than politics. That is, as satiety has fallen prey to and become identified with domination. We must identify at the outset what we mean by domination, because the content of this notion is central to Freudian instinct theory. Domination is in effect whenever the individual's goals and purposes and the means of striving for and attaining them are prescribed to him and performed by him as something prescribed. Domination can be exercised by men, by nature, by things. It can also be internal, exercised by the individual on himself, and appear in the form of autonomy. This second form plays a decisive role in Freudian instinct theory. The superego absorbs the authoritarian models, the father and his representatives, and makes their commands and prohibitions its own laws, the individual's conscience. Mastery of drives becomes the individual's own accomplishment, autonomy. Under these circumstances, however, freedom becomes an impossible concept, for there is nothing that is not prescribed for the individual in some way or other. And in fact freedom can be defined only within the framework of domination, if previous history is to provide a guide to the definition of freedom. Freedom is a form of domination, the one in which the means provided satisfy the needs of the individual with a minimum of displeasure and renunciation. In this sense freedom is completely historical, and the degree of freedom can be determined only historically. Capacities and needs as well as the minimum of renunciation differ depending on the level of cultural development and are subject to objective conditions. But it is precisely the fact of being objectively, historically conditioned that makes the distinction between freedom and domination transcend any merely subjective valuation. Like human needs and capacities themselves, the means of satisfying the needs produced at a particular level of culture are socially given facts, present in material and mental productive forces and in the possibilities for their application. Civilization can use these possibilities in the interest of individual gratification of needs and so will be organized under the aspects of freedom. Under optimal conditions domination is reduced to a rational division of labor and experience, freedom and happiness converge. On the other hand, individual satisfaction itself may be subordinated to a social need that limits and diverts these possibilities. In that case the social and the individual needs become separate, and civilization is operating through domination. A hitherto existing culture has been organized in the form of domination insofar as social needs have been determined by the interests of the ruling groups at any given time. And this interest has defined the needs of other groups and the means and limitations of their satisfactions. Contemporary civilization has developed social wealth to a point where the renunciations and burdens placed on individuals seem more and more unnecessary and irrational. The irrationality of unfreedom is most crassly expressed in the intensified subjection of individuals to the enormous apparatus of production and distribution, in the deprivatization of free time, in the almost indistinguishable fusion of constructive and destructive social labor. And it is precisely this fusion that is the condition of the constantly increasing productivity and domination of nature which keeps individuals, or at least the majority of them in the advanced countries, living in increasing comfort. Thus irrationality becomes the form of social reason, becomes the rational universal. Psychologically, and that is all that concerns us here, the difference between domination and freedom is becoming smaller. The individual reproduces on the deepest level, in his instinctual structure, the values and behavior patterns that serve to maintain domination, while domination becomes increasingly less autonomous, less personal, more objective and universal. What actually dominates is the economic, political, and cultural apparatus, which has become an indivisible unity constructed by social labor. To be sure, the individual has always reproduced domination from within himself, and to the extent that domination represented and developed the whole, this reproduction has been of service to rational self-preservation and self-development. From the outset the whole has asserted itself in the sacrifice of the happiness and the freedom of a great part of mankind. It has always contained a self-contradiction, which has been embodied in the political and spiritual forces striving toward a different form of life. What is peculiar to the present stage is the neutralization of this contradiction, the mastering of the tension between the given form of life and its negation. A refusal in the name of the greater freedom which is historically possible. Where the neutralization of this contradiction is now most advanced, the possible is scarcely still known and desired, especially by those on whose knowing and willing its realization depends, those who alone could make it something really possible. In the most technically advanced centers of the contemporary world, society has been hammered into a unity as never before. What is possible is defined and realized by the forces that have brought about this unity. The future is to remain theirs, and individuals are to desire and bring about this future, in freedom. In freedom, for compulsion presupposes a contradiction that can express itself in resistance. The totalitarian state is only one of the forms, a form perhaps already obsolete, in which the battle against the historical possibility of liberation takes place. The other, the democratic form, rejects terror because it is strong and rich enough to preserve and reproduce itself without terror. Most individuals are in fact better off in this form. But what determines its historical direction is not this fact, but the way it organizes and utilizes the productive forces at its disposal. It, too, maintains society at the attained level, despite all technical progress. It, too, works against the new forms of freedom that are historically possible. In this sense its rationality, too, is regressive, although it works with more painless and more comfortable means and methods. But that it does so should not repress the consciousness that in the democratic form freedom is played off against its complete realization, reality against possibility. To compare potential freedom with existing freedom, to see the latter in the light of the former, presupposes that at the present stage of civilization much of the toil, renunciation, and regulation imposed upon men is no longer justified by scarcity, the struggle for existence, poverty, and weakness. Society could afford a high degree of instinctual liberation without losing what it has accomplished or putting a stop to its progress. The basic trend of such liberation, as indicated by Freudian theory, would be the recovery of a large part of the instinctual energy diverted to alienated labor, and its release for the fulfillment of the autonomously developing needs of individuals. That would in fact also be desublimation, but a desublimation that would not destroy the spiritualized manifestations of human energy but rather take them as projects for impossibilities of happy satisfaction. The result would be not a reversion to the prehistory of civilization but rather a fundamental change in the content and goal of civilization, in the principle of progress. I shall try to explain this elsewhere. Here I should simply like to point out that the realization of this possibility presupposes fundamentally changed social and cultural institutions. In the existing culture that progression appears as a catastrophe, and the battle against it as a necessity, with the result that the forces tending toward it are paralyzed. Freudian instinct theory reveals this neutralization of the dynamic of freedom in terms of psychology, and Freud made visible its necessity, its consequences for the individual, and its limits. We will formulate these dimensions in the form of theses, using but also going beyond the concepts of Freudian instinct theory. Within the framework of civilization which has become historical reality, freedom is possibly only on the basis of unfreedom, that is, on the basis of instinctual suppression. For in terms of its instinctual structure, the organism is directed toward procuring pleasure, it is dominated by the pleasure principle, the instincts strive for pleasurable release of tension, for painless satisfaction of needs. They resist delay of gratification, limitation and sublimation of pleasure, non-libidinal work. But culture is sublimation, postponed, method 1/highly controlled satisfaction which presupposes unhappiness. The struggle for existence, scarcity, and cooperation all compel renunciation and repression in the interest of security, order, and living together. Cultural progress consists in ever greater and more conscious production of the technical, material, and intellectual conditions of progress and work, itself unsatisfying, on the means of satisfaction. Freedom in civilization has its internal limit in the necessity of gaining and maintaining labor power in the organism, of transforming him from a subject-object of pleasure into a subject-object of work. This is the social content of the overcoming of the pleasure principle through the reality principle, which becomes from earliest childhood the dominant principle in the psychic processes. Only this transformation, which leaves an unhealable wound in men, makes them fit for society and thus for life, for without secure cooperation it is impossible to survive in a hostile and niggardly environment. It is only this traumatic transformation, which is an alienation of man from nature in the authentic sense, an alienation from his own nature, that makes man capable of enjoyment. Only the instinct that has been restrained and mastered raises the merely natural satisfaction of need to pleasure that is experienced and comprehended to happiness. But from then on all happiness is only of a sort that is consonant with social restrictions, and man's growing freedom is based on unfreedom. According to Freud's theory, this intertwining is inevitable and indissoluble. In order to understand this, we must pursue his theory of instincts a little further. In doing so, we will proceed from the late version of the theory, developed after 1920. It is the metapsychological, even metaphysical version, but perhaps precisely for that reason it is also the one that contains the deepest and most revolutionary nucleus of Freudian theory. The organism develops through the activity of two original basic instincts, the life instinct, sexuality, which Freud for the most part now calls eros, and the death instinct, the destructive instinct. While the former strives for the binding of living substance into ever larger and more permanent units, the death instinct desires regression to the condition before birth, without needs and thus without pain. It strives for the annihilation of life, for reversion to inorganic matter. The organism equipped with such an antagonistic instinctual structure finds itself in an environment which is too poor and too hostile for the immediate gratification of the life instincts. Eros desires life under the pleasure principle, but the environment stands in the way of this goal. Thus, as soon as the life instinct has subjected the death instinct to itself, a subjection which is simultaneous with the beginning and the continuation of life, the environment compels a decisive modification of the instincts. In part they are diverted from their original goal or inhibited on the way to it. In part the area of their activity is limited and their direction is changed. The result of this modification is gratification which is inhibited, delayed, and vicarious, but also secure, useful, and relatively lasting. Thus the psychic dynamic takes the form of a constant struggle of three basic forces, eros, the death instinct, and the outside world. Corresponding to these three forces are the three basic principles which according to Freud determine the functions of the psychic apparatus, the pleasure principle, the nirvana principle, and the reality principle. If the pleasure principle stands for the unlimited unfolding of the life instinct, and the nirvana principle for regression into the painless condition before birth, then the reality principle signifies the totality of the modifications of those instincts compelled by the outside world. It signifies reason as reality itself. It seems that there is a dichotomy hidden behind the tripartite division. If the death instinct presses for the annihilation of life because life is the predominance of displeasure, tension, and need, then the nirvana principle too would be a form of the pleasure principle, and the death instinct would be dangerously close to eros. On the other hand, eros itself seems to partake of the nature of the death instinct. The striving for pacification, for making pleasure eternal, indicates an instinctual resistance in eros as well to the continual appearance of new tensions, to giving up a pleasurable equilibrium once reached. This resistance, if not hostile to life, is nevertheless static and thus antagonistic to progress. Freud saw the original unity of the two opposing instincts. He spoke of the conservative nature common to them, of the inner weight and inertia of all life. He rejected this thought in fear, one might almost say, and maintained the duality of eros and the death instinct, the pleasure principle and the nirvana principle, despite the difficulty, which he emphasized several times, of demonstrating any drives in the organism other than a riggy middle. The plasticity of the instincts which this theory presupposes should suffice to refute the notion that the instincts are essentially unalterable biological substrata. Only the energy of the instincts and to some extent their localization remain fundamentally unchanged. Nulli libidinous ones. It is the effective mixture of the two fundamental instincts that defines life. Although forced into the service of eros, the death instinct retains the energy proper to it, except that this destructive energy is diverted from the organism itself and directed toward the outside world in the form of socially useful aggression toward nature and sanctioned enemies, or, in the form of conscience, of morality. It is used by the superego for the socially useful mastery of one's own drives. the instincts of destruction become of service to the life instincts in this form, but only in that the latter are decisively transformed. Freud devoted the major portion of his work to analyzing the transformations of Eros. Here we shall emphasize only what is decisive for the fate of freedom. Eros as the life instinct to sexuality, and sexuality in its original function is deriving pleasure from the zones of the body, no more and no less. Freud expressly adds, a pleasure which only afterwards is placed in the service of reproduction. This indicates the polymorphous perverse character of sexuality. In terms of their object, the instincts are indifferent with respect to one's own and other bodies. Above all, they are not localized in specific parts of the body or limited to special functions. The primacy of genital sexuality and of reproduction, which then become reproduction in monogamous marriage, is to a certain extent a subsequent development, a late achievement of the reality principle, that is, a historical achievement of human society in its necessary struggle against the pleasure principle, which is not compatible with society. Originally, the organism in its totality and in all its activities and relationships is a potential field for sexuality, dominated by the pleasure principle. And the notion of origin as Freud uses it has simultaneously structural, functional and temporal, ontogenetic, and phylogenetic significance. The original structure of the instincts was the one which dominated in the prehistory of the species. It is transformed during the course of history but continues to be effective as a substratum, precognital and unconscious, in the history of the individual and the species, most obviously so in early childhood. The idea that mankind, in gen-mittel and in its individuals, is Li/L dominated hierarchical powers is one of fr less than Ud's most profound insight. Precisely for this reason it must be desexualized in order to carry out unpleasurable work, in order, in fact, to live in a context of unpleasurable work. Here we can out only the two most important aspects of the process of desexualization which Freud describes. First, the blocking off of the so-called partial instincts, that is, of pre- and non-genital sexuality, which proceed from the body as a total erogenous zone. The partial instincts either lose their independence, become subservient to genitality and thereby to reproduction by being made into preliminary stages, or they become sublimated and, if there is resistance, suppressed and tabooed as perversions. Second, sexuality and the sexual object are desensualized in love, the ethical taming and inhibiting of Eros. This is one of the greatest achievements of civilization and one of the latest. It alone makes the patriarchal monogamous family the healthy nucleus of society. The overcoming of the Oedipus complex is the precondition for this. In this process Eros, which originally includes everything, is reduced to the special function of genital sexuality and its accompaniments. Eroticism is limited to the socially acceptable minimum. Now Eros is no longer the life instinct governing the whole organism and striving to become the formative principle for the human and natural environment. It has become a private matter for which there is neither time nor place in the necessary social relations of men, labor relations, and Eros becomes general only as the reproductive function. The suppression of instincts for sublimation is also suppression becomes the basic condition of life in civilized society. This biological-psychological transformation determines the fundamental experience of human existence and the goal of human life. Life is experienced as a struggle with oneself and the environment, it is suffered and won by conquests. Its substance is unpleasure, not pleasure. Happiness is a reward, relaxation, coincidence, a moment in any case, not the goal of existence. That goal is rather labor. And labor is essentially alienated labor. Only in privileged situations does man work for himself in his occupation, does he satisfy his own needs, sublimated and unsublimated, in his occupation. Normally he is busy all day long carrying out a prescribed social function, while his self-fulfillment, if there is any, is limited to a scanty free time. The social structuring of time is patterned on the structuring of the instincts completed in childhood. Only the limitation of eros makes possible the limitation of free, that is, pleasurable time to a minimum deducted from full-time labor. And time, like existence itself, is divided into the primary content alienated labor and the secondary content non-labor. But the structuring of the instincts that dethrones the pleasure principle also makes possible ethics, which has become increasingly more decisive in the development of Western civilization. The individual reproduces instinctively the cultural negation of the pleasure principle, renunciation, the I-pathos of labor, in the repressively modified instincts social legislation becomes the individual's own legislation. The Nechesh! Exclamation marks Aryan freedom appears as an act of his autonomy and thus as freedom. If the Freudian theory of the instincts had stopped here, it would be little more than the psychological grounding of the idealist concept of freedom, which in turn had given a philosophical foundation to the facts of cultural domination. This philosophical concept defines freedom in opposition to pleasure, so that the control, even the suppression of instinctual sensuous aims appears to be a condition of the possibility of freedom. For Kant, freedom is essentially moral intelligible freedom, and as such it is compulsion. The less man can be physically compelled, but the more he can rather be morally compelled, through the mere mental representation of duty, the more free he is. 3. The step from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom here is progress from physical to moral compulsion, but the object of the compulsion remains the same, man as a member of the sensuous world. And the moral compulsion is not only moral, it has its own very physical institutions. From the family to the factory to the army, they surround the individual as the effective embodiments of the reality principle. Political freedom is developed on this double basis of moral compulsion, wrung from absolutism and bloody street conflicts and battles. It is set up, secured, and neutralized in the self-discipline and self-renunciation of individuals. They have learned that their inalienable freedom is subject to duties, not the least of which is the suppression of instinctual drives. Moral and physical compulsion have a common denominator: domination. Domination is the internal logic of the development of civilization. In acknowledging it, Freud is at one with idealistic ethics and with liberal bourgeois politics. Freedom must contain compulsion, scarcity, the struggle for existence, and the amoral nature of the instincts make the suppression of instinctual drives indispensable. The alternative is progress or barbarism. It must be emphasized again that for Freud the most fundamental reason for the necessity to suppress the instincts is the integral claim of the pleasure principle, that is, the fact that the organism is constitutionally directed toward calm through fulfillment, gratification, peace. The conservative nature of the instincts makes them unproductive in the deepest sense, unproductive for the alienated productivity that is the motor of cultural progress, so unproductive that even the self-preservation of the organism is not an original goal as long as self-preservation means predominance of displeasure. In Freud's late instinct theory there is no longer an independent drive for self-preservation, It is a manifestation either of eros or of aggression. For this reason, unproductiveness and conservatism must be overcome if the species is to develop a civilized communal life. Common peace and the pleasure principle are worth nothing in the struggle for existence. The program for becoming happy which the pleasure principle presses upon us cannot be fulfilled. For the repressive transformation of the instincts becomes the biological constitution of he organism. History rules even in the instinctual structure. Culture becomes nature as soon as the individual learns to affirm and to reproduce the reality principle from within himself, through his instincts. In limiting eros to the partial function of sexuality and making the destructive instinct useful, the individual becomes, in his very nature, the subject object of socially useful labor, of the domination of men and nature. Technology too is born of suppression. Even the highest achievements for making human existence less burdensome bear witness to their origin in the rape of nature and in the deadening of human nature. Individual freedom is not a product of civilization. As soon as civilized society establishes itself, the repressive transformation of the instincts becomes the psychological basis of a threefold domination. First, domination over oneself, over one's own nature, over the sensual drives that want only pleasure and gratification. Second, domination of the labor achieved by such disciplined and controlled individuals. And third, domination of outward nature, science, and technology. And to domination subdivided in this way belongs the threefold freedom proper to it. First, freedom from the mere necessity of satisfying one's drives. That is, freedom for renunciation and thus for socially acceptable pleasure, moral freedom. Second, freedom from arbitrary violence and from the anarchy of the struggle for existence, social freedom characterized by the division of labor, with legal rights and duties, political freedom. And third, freedom from the power of nature, that is, the mastery of nature, freedom to change the world through human reason, intellectual freedom. The psychic substance common to these three aspects of freedom is unfreedom, domination of one's instincts, domination that society makes into second nature and that perpetuates the institutions of domination. But civilized unfreedom is oppression of a particular kind. It is rational unfreedom, rational domination. It is rational to the extent that it makes possible the ascent from a human animal to a human being, from nature to civilization. But does it remain rational when civilization has developed completely? This is the point at which the Freudian theory of the instincts questions the development of civilization. The question arose in the course of psychoanalytic practice, of clinical experience, which for Freud opened the way to theory. Thus it is in the individual and from the point of view of the individual and in fact from the point of view of the sick, neurotic individual that civilization is put in low question. The sickness is one's individual fate, private history, but in psychoanalysis the private reveals itself to be a particular instance of the general destiny, of the traumatic wound that the repressive transformation of the instincts has inflicted on man. When Freud then asks what civilization has made of man, he is contrasting civilization not with the idea of some natural condition but rather with the historically developing needs of individuals and with the possibilities for their fulfillment. Freud's answer has already been indicated in what has been said. The more civilization progresses, the more powerful its apparatus for the development and gratification of social needs becomes, the more oppressive are the sacrifices that it has to impose on individuals in order to maintain the necessary instinctual structure. The thesis contained in the Freudian theory asserts that repression increases with cultural progress because the aggression to be suppressed increases. The assertion seems more than questionable when we compare present freedoms with previous ones. Sexual morality is certainly much more relaxed than it was in the 19th century. Certainly the patriarchal authority structure, and with it the family as the agency of education, of socialization of the individual, has been considerably weakened. Certainly political liberties in the Western world are much more widespread than they were previously, even though the substance of the fascist period is alive in them again and there is no need to prove the growth of aggression. Nevertheless, when we consider the greater liberality of public and private morality, the essential connection that, according to Freud, existed between these facts and the instinctual dynamic is by no means immediately evident. But the present situation appears in another light when we apply the Freudian categories to it more concretely. There are two orientations for this examination of Freudian instinct theory. The first is in terms of the reification and automatization of the ego. According to Freudian instinct theory, the reality principle works primarily through the processes that occur between the id, the ego, and the superego, between the unconscious, the conscious, and the outside world. The ego, or rather the conscious part of the ego, fights a battle on two fronts, against the id and against the outside world, with frequently shifting alliances. Essentially, the struggle centers on the degree of instinctual freedom to be allowed and the modifications, sublimations, and repressions to be carried out. The conscious ego plays a leading role in this struggle. The decision is really its decision, it is, at least in the normal case of the mature individual, the responsible master of the psychic processes. But this mastery has undergone a crucial change. Franz Alexander pointed out that the ego becomes corporeal, so to speak, and that its reactions to the outside world and to the instinctual desires emerging from the id become increasingly automatic. The conscious processes of confrontation are replaced to an increasing degree by immediate, almost physical reactions in which comprehending consciousness, thought, and even one's own feelings play a very small role. It is as though the free space which the individual has at his disposal for his psychic processes has been greatly narrowed down. It is no longer possible for something like an individual psyche with its own demands and decisions to develop. The space is occupied by public, social forces. His reduction of the relatively autonomous ego is empirically observable in people's frozen gestures, and in the growing passivity of leisure time activities, which become more and more inescapably deprivatized, centralized, universalized in the bad sense, and as such controlled. This process is the psychic correlate of the social overpowering of the opposition, the impotence of criticism, technical coordination, and the permanent mobilization of the collective. The second change is the strengthening of extra-familial authority. The social development that has dethroned the individual as an economic subject has also reduced, to an extreme degree, the individualistic function of the family in favor of more effective powers. The younger generation is taught the reality principle less through the family than outside the family. It learns socially useful reactions and ways of behaving outside of the protected private sphere of the family. The modern father is not a very effective representative of the reality principle, and the loosening of sexual morality makes it easier to overcome the Oedipus complex. The struggle against the father loses much of its decisive psychological significance. But the effect of this is to strengthen rather than to weaken the omnipotence of domination. Precisely insofar as the family was something private, it stood against public power, or at least was different from it. The more the family is now controlled by public power, That is, the more the models and examples are taken from outside it, the more unified and uninterrupted becomes the socialization of the young generation in the interest of public power, as a part of public power. Here too the psychic space in which independence and difference could emerge is limited and occupied. In order to make the historical function of these psychic changes evident, we must try to see them in connection with contemporary political structures. The defining characteristic of these structures has been called mass democracy. Without discussing whether we are justified in using this concept, we will outline its main components briefly. In mass democracy, the real elements of politics are no longer identifiable individual groups but rather unified or politically integrated totalities. There are two dominant units. First, the giant production and distribution apparatus of modern industry, and second, the masses which serve this apparatus. Having control of the apparatus, or even of its key positions, means having control of the masses in such a way, in fact, that this control seems to result automatically from the division of labor, to be its technical result, the rationale of the functioning middle apparatus that spans and maintains the whole society. Thus domination appears as a technical administrative quality, and this quality fuses the different groups that hold the key positions in the apparatus economic, political, military into a technical administrative collective that represents the whole. On the other hand, the groups that serve the apparatus are united into the masses, the people. Through a technical necessity, the people become the object of administration even where they, the sovereign, delegate power freely and control it democratically. This technical administrative collectivization appears as the expression of objective reason, that is, as the form in which the whole reproduces and extends itself. All freedoms are predetermined and preformed by it and subordinated not so much to political force as to the rational demands of the apparatus. The latter encompasses the public and private existence of individuals, of those who administer it as well as those who are administered. It encompasses work time and free time, service and relaxation, nature and culture. But in doing so the apparatus invades the inner sphere of the person himself, his instincts and his intelligence, and this occurs differently than in the earlier stages of the development. It no longer occurs primarily as the intervention of a brutal external, personal, or natural force, no longer even as the free working of competition, of the economy, but rather as completely objectified technological reason, which appears idly rational, methodically controlled and legitimized. Thus the masses are no longer simply those who are dominated, but rather the governed who are no longer in opposition, or whose opposition itself is integrated into the positive whole, as a calculable and manipulable corrective that demands improvements in the apparatus. What was previously a political subject has become an object, and the antagonistic interests that were previously irreconcilable seem to have passed over into a true collective interest. With this, however, the political picture as a whole has been transformed. There is no longer an autonomous subject across from the object, a subject that governs and in doing so pursues its own definable interests and goals. Domination tends to become neutral, interchangeable, without the totality itself being changed by this change. Domination is dependent only on the capacity and the drive to maintain and extend the apparatus as a whole. One visible political expression of this neutralization is the increasing resemblance in the most advanced countries of political parties previously opposed to one another, of their strategy and their goals, the growing unification of political language and political symbols. and the supranational and even supercontinental unification tie is taking place despite all resistance, and that does not stop even at countries with very different political systems. Might the neutralization of contradictions and a tendency to increasing international resemblance finally determine the relationship of the two opposing total systems, those of the Western and Eastern worlds? There are signs of this. This political digression may help to illuminate the historical function of the psychic dynamic uncovered by Freud. The political collectivization has its counterpart in the neutralization of the psychic structure, which was briefly described above, the unification of the ego and the superego, through which the ego's free confrontation with paternal authority is absorbed by social reason. To the technical administrative quality of domination correspond the automatization and reification of the ego, in which free actions become rigidified to reactions. But the ego that has been robbed of its independent power to structure its instincts, and delivered over to the superego, is all the more a subject of destruction and all the less a subject of eros. For the superego is the social agent of repression and the locus of the socially useful destruction stored up in the psyche. Thus it seems that the psychic atoms of contemporary society are themselves as explosive as is social productivity. Behind the technical administrative rational quality of the unification appears the danger of the irrationality that has still not been mastered in Freud's language, the harshness of the sacrifice that existing civilization must demand of individuals. As productivity increases, the taboos and instinctual prohibitions on which social productivity rests have to be guarded with ever greater anxiety. And might we say, going beyond Freud, that this is so because the temptation to enjoy this increasing productivity and freedom and happiness becomes increasingly strong and increasingly rational? In any case, Freud speaks of an intensification of the feeling of guilt in the progress of civilization, of its increase perhaps to extremes that the individual finds hard to tolerate. At one end he sees in this feeling of guilt the expression of the conflicts of ambivalence of 1.1 the perpetual struggle between eros and the destructive or death instinct. 7th is Freud's revolutionary instinct. The conflict that is decisive for the fate of civilization is that between the reality of repression and the almost equally real possibility of doing away with repression, between the increase of eros necessary for civilization and the equally necessary suppression of its claims for pleasure. To the extent that the emancipation of eros can be more and more clearly envisaged as social wealth increases, its repression becomes harsher and harsher. And thus, just as this repression weakens eros' power to bind the death instinct, it also releases destructive energy from its bonds and frees aggression to a hitherto unknown extent, which in turn makes more intensive control and manipulation a political necessity. This is the fatal dialectic of civilization, which, according to Freud, has no solution, just as the struggle between eros and the death instinct, productivity and destruction, has no solution. But if we are justified in seeing in this conflict the contradiction between socially necessary oppression and the historical possibility of going beyond it, then the increasing feeling of guilt would be characterized by the same contradiction. The guilt then lies not only in the continued existence of prohibited instinctual impulses, hostility toward the father and desire for the mother, but also in the acceptance and even complicity with suppression, that is, in reinstating, internalizing, and defying paternal authority and thus domination as such. What on more primitive cultural levels was perhaps not only a social but also a biological necessity for the further development of the species has become, at the height of civilization, a merely social, political necessity for maintaining the status quo. The incest taboo is the historical and structural prima causa for the whole chain of taboos and repressions that characterize patriarchal monogamous society. These perpetuate the subordination of gratification to a productivity that transcends itself and destroys itself, and perpetuates the mutilation of eros, of the life instincts. Hence the feeling of guilt about a freedom that one has both missed and betrayed. Freud's definition of the conflict in civilization as the expression of the eternal struggle between eros and the death instinct points to an internal contradiction in Freudian theory, which contradiction, in turn, as a genuine one, contains the possibility of its own solution, a possibility that psychoanalysis has almost repressed. Freud emphasizes that civilization obeys an inner erotic impulse that tells it to unite men in an increasingly intimately bound mass. If this is true, how can what Freud repeatedly emphasized as the amoral and asocial, even anti-moral and antisocial nature of eros be at the same time one that creates civilization? How can the integral claim of the pleasure principle, which outweighs even the drive for self-preservation, how can the polymorphous perverse character of sexuality be an erotic impulse to civilization? It does not help to assign the two sides of a contradiction to two successive stages of development. Freud ascribes both sides to the original nature of eros. Instead, we must sustain the contradiction itself and find in it the way to its solution. When Freud ascribes the goal of uniting the organic in ever greater units, 9 of producing and preserving ever greater units, to the sexual drives, this striving is at work in every process that preserves life, from the first union of the germ cells to the formation of cultural communities, society and nation. This drive stands under the aegis of the pleasure principle. It is precisely the polymorphous character of sexuality that drives beyond the special function to which it is limited, toward gaining more intensive and extensive pleasure, toward the generation of libidinous ties with one's fellow men, the production of a libidinous, that is, happy environment. Civilization arises from pleasure. We must hold fast to this thesis in all its provocativeness. Freud writes, the same process occurs in the social relations of men that psychoanalytic research has become familiar with in regard to the course of development of individual libido. Libido involves itself in gratifying the major needs of life and chooses for its first objects the persons who participate in this activity. And as with the individual, so in the development of mankind as a whole, love alone, in the sense of turning from egoism to altruism, has acted as the force of civilization. 11. It is eros, not agape, it is the drive that has not yet been split into sublimated and unsublimated energy, from which this effect proceeds. The work that has contributed so essentially to the development of man from animal is originally libidinous. Freud states expressly that sexual as well as sublimated love is connected to communal labor. 12. Man begins working because he finds pleasure in work, not only after work, pleasure in the play of his faculties and the fulfillment of his life needs, not as a means of life but as life itself. Man begins the cultivation of nature and of himself, cooperation, in order to secure and perpetuate the gaining of pleasure. It is perhaps Geza R. 6 Hein who has most penetratingly presented and tried to prove this thesis. If this is so, however, the Freudian conception of the relationship between civilization and the dynamic of the instincts is in need of a decisive correction. The conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle would then be neither biologically necessary nor insoluble nor soluble only through a repressive transformation of the instincts. and the repressive solution would then be not a natural process extended into history and compelled by an ineluctable struggle for existence, weakness, and hostility, but rather a socio-historical process which has become part of nature. The traumatic transformation of the organism into an instrument of alienated labor is not the psychic condition of civilization as such but only of civilization as domination, that is, of a specific form of civilization. Constitutional on-freedom would not be the condition of freedom in civilization but rather only of freedom in a civilization organized on the basis of domination, which in fact is what existing civilization is. Freud actually did derive the fate of the instincts from that of domination. It is the despotism of the primal father that forces the development of the instincts into the path which then becomes the psychological foundation for rational, domination-based civilization, which, however, never abandoned its roots in the original domination. Since the rebellion of the sons and brothers against the primal father 18 and the re-establishment and internalization of paternal authority, domination, religion, and morality have been intimately connected, and in such a way that the latter provide the psychological foundation for the permanence and the legitimized organization the reason of domination but at the same time make domination universal. Just as all share in the guilt, the rebellion, so all must make sacrifices, in duting those who now rule. The masters, like the servants, submit to limitations on their instinctual gratification, on pleasure. But just as repression of the instill wants makes every servant master in his own house, so it also reproduces masters over all houses. With instinctual repression social domination fortifies its position as a universal reason. This takes place in the organization of labor. The development of domination through the organization of labor is a process the study of which belongs to political economy rather than psychology. But the somatic psychic preconditions for this development which Freud uncovered make it possible to pinpoint the hypothetical point at which civilization based on instinctual repression stops being historically rational and reproducing historical reason. To demonstrate that this is possible, let me summarize again the main factors in the dynamic of the instincts insofar as they are decisive for the labor process. First, repressive modifications of sexuality make the organism free to be used as an instrument of unpleasurable but socially useful labor. Second, if this labor is a lifelong chief occupation, that is, has become the universal means of life, then the original direction of the instincts is so distorted that the content of life is no longer gratification but rather working toward it. Third, in this way civilization reproduces itself on an increasingly extended scale. The energy won from sexuality and sublimated constantly increases the psychic investment fund for the increasing productivity of labor, technical progress. Fourth, increasing productivity of labor increases the possibility of enjoyment and thus the potential reversal of the socially compelled relationship between labor and enjoyment, labor time and free time. But the domination reproduced in the existing relationships also reproduces sublimation on an increasing scale. The goods produced for enjoyment remain commodities, the enjoyment of which presupposes further labor within existing relationships. Gratification remains a byproduct of ungratifying labor. Increasing productivity itself becomes the necessity which it was to eliminate. Thus, fifth, the sacrifices that socialized individuals have imposed on themselves since the fall of the primal father become increasingly more irrational the more obviously reason has fulfilled its purpose and eliminated the original state of need. And the guilt which the sacrifices were to expiate through the deification and internalization of the father, religion and morality, remains unexpiated, because with the re-establishment of patriarchal authority, although in the form of rational universality, the suppressed wish for its annihilation remains alive. Indeed, the guilt becomes increasingly oppressive as this domination reveals its archaic character in the light of historical possibilities for liberation. At this stage of development, unfreedom appears no longer as the fundamental condition of rational freedom but rather as a limitation on freedom. The achievements of domination-based civilization have undermined the necessity for unfreedom. The degree of domination of nature and of social wealth attained makes it possible to reduce ungratifying labor to a minimum. Quantity is transformed into quality. Free time can become the content of life and work can become the free play of human capacities. In this way the repressive structure of the instincts would be explosively transformed. The instinctual energies that would no longer be caught up in ungratifying work would become free and, as Eros, would strive to universalize libidinous relationships and develop a libidinous civilization. But although in the light of this possibility the necessity of instinctual repression appears irrational, it remains not only a social but also a biological necessity for men in existing society. For the repression of the instincts reproduced renunciation in the individuals themselves, and the apparatus of need gratification that they have constructed reproduces the individuals themselves in the form of labor power. We have already said that the Freudian theory of the instincts in its fundamental conception seems to represent the psychological counterpart of the ethical idealist notion of freedom. Despite Freud's mechanistic materialist notion of the soul, freedom contains its own repression, its own unfreedom, because without this unfreedom men would fall back to the animal level. Individual freedom is not a product of civilization. And just as idealist ethics interprets the freedom that suppresses sensuousness as an ontological structure and sees in it the essence of human freedom, so Freud sees in the repressive scion of the instincts both a cultural and a natural necessity, scarcity, the struggle for existence, and the anarchical character of the instincts place limits on freedom which cannot be traced. See past. We can now follow these parallels further. A second essential moment of the idealist notion of freedom, most clearly expressed in existential philosophy, is transcendence. Human freedom is the possibility, even the necessity, of going beyond, negating every given situation in existence, because in relation to men's possibilities every situation itself is negativity, a barrier, something other. Human existence thus seems, to use Sartre's notion, an eternal project, which never reaches fulfillment, plenitude, rest. The contradiction between in itself and for itself can never be solved in a real being in and for itself. This negativity of the notion of freedom also finds its psychological formulation in Freud's instinct theory. This becomes evident when we remember the conservative nature of the instincts, which produces the lifelong conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The basic instincts are striving essentially for gratification, perpetuation of pleasure, but the fulfillment of this striving would be the death of man, both his natural and his socio-historical death, natural death in being the condition before birth, historical death in being the state before civilization. Sublimation is the psychological transcendence in which civilized freedom consists. The negation of a negativity which itself still remains negative not only because it is repression of sensuality but also because it perpetuates itself as transcendence, the productivity of renunciation, which spurs itself on endlessly. But what in idealist ethics remains wrapped up and concealed in an ontological structure and in this form is transfigured as the crown of humanity appears in Freud as a traumatic wound, a disease that culture has inflicted on man and that cries out for healing. Increasing destruction and constriction, growing anxiety, discontent with civilization that grows out of the suppression of the wish for happiness, out of the sacrifice of the possibility of happiness. All lies is not the other side of civilized freedom but its inner logic, and must be controlled and supervised all the more strictly the nearer civilization, in progressing, brings the possibility of happiness and the more it transforms a utopian fantasy into an undertaking that can be directed by science and knowledge. Thus Freud reveals the actual negativity of freedom, and in refusing to transfigure it idealistically he preserves the idea of another possible freedom in which the repression of the instincts would be abolished along with political oppression, while the achievements of repression would be preserved. In Freud there is nothing like a return to nature or to natura. Man, the process of civilization is irreversible. If instinctual repression can be done away with to the point where the existing relationship of labor and enjoyment can be reversed, the archaic sublimation of erotic energy can be revoked. If, therefore, sensuousness and reason, happiness and freedom can be brought into harmony or even unity, this is possible only at the height of the development of civilization, where the state of absolute need and lack could be done away with, technically at least, and where the struggle for existence no longer need be a struggle for the means of existence. Freud was more than skeptical with regard to this possibility. He was all the more so in that he had seen the profound connection between growing productivity and growing destruction, between increasing control of nature and increasing control of men, long before the atom and hydrogen bombs and before that total mobilization that began with the period of fascism and evidently has not yet reached its peak. He saw that men must be kept in line with ever better and more effective means the greater social wealth becomes, the wealth that would be able to satisfy their freely not manipulated developing needs. This is perhaps the final reason for Freud's assertion that the progress of civilization has intensified guilt feeling to almost unbearable heights, the feeling of guilt about the prohibited instinctual wishes that are still active despite almost lifelong repression. He maintained that these forbidden and living instinctual impulses are directed in the final instance toward the father and mother, but in his late work they are distinguished increasingly dearly from their first biological psychological form. The feeling of guilt is now defined as the expression of the conflict of ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the destruction or death instinct. 14 And a puzzling statement reads, "What began with the father is completed in the masses." 15 Civilization obeys an inner erotic impulse when it unites men in intimately connected communities, it obeys the pleasure principle. But eros is connected to the death instinct, the pleasure principle to the nirvana principle. The conflict has to be fought out, and as long as this community knows only the form of the family, it expresses itself in the Oedipus complex. To understand the full import of the Freudian conception, one must be aware of the way the forces are distributed in this conflict. The father, in forbidding the son the mother he desires, represents eros, which restricts the regression of the death instinct and thereby, repressive eros, which limits the pleasure principle to pleasure compatible with life but also with society, and thus releases destructive energy. There is a corresponding ambivalence of love and hate in the relationship to the father. The mother is the goal of eros one and of the death instinct. Behind the sexual wish stands the wish for regression to the condition before birth, the undifferentiated union of the pleasure principle and the nirvana principle on this side of the reality principle, and thus without ambivalence, pure libido. The erotic impulse to civilization then extends beyond the family and joins greater and greater social groups. The conflict becomes intensified in forms that depend on the past. Paternal domination extends itself triumphantly, and thus the ambivalence conflict does too. At the height of civilization it plays itself out in and against the masses, who have incorporated the father into themselves. And the more universal domination becomes, the more universal becomes the destruction that it releases. The conflict between eros and the death instinct belongs to the innermost essence of the development of civilization, as long as it occurs in forms that depend on the past. Thus the thought Freud expresses so often is emphasized again, that the history of mankind is still dominated by archaic powers, that prehistory and early history are still at work in us. The return of the repressed takes place at the fearful turning points of history, in the hatred of and rebellion against the father, in the deification and restoration of paternal authority. The erotic impulses to civilization that strive for the union of happiness and freedom fall prey to domination over and over again, and protest suffocates in destruction. Only seldom and cautiously did Freud express the hope that civilization would finally realize at some date the freedom that it could have realized for so long, and thus conquer the archaic powers. Civilization and its discontents closes with the words, "Men have brought their powers of subduing the forces of nature to such a pitch that by using them they could now very easily exterminate one another to the last man." They know this, hence arises a great part of their current unrest, their dejection, their mood of apprehension. And now it may be expected that the other of the two heavenly forces, eternal Eros, will put forth his strength so as to maintain himself alongside of his equally immortal adversary. 1:6 That was written in 1930. In the time that has passed since then there has been truly no trace of the opponent's growing retaliation, of the approach of that happy freedom, of Eros as creator of civilization. Or does perhaps the increasing activity of destruction, which presents an ever more rational face, indicate that civilization is proceeding toward a catastrophe that will pull the archaic forces down with it in its collapse and thus clear the way to a higher stage? Notes 1. See this text, pages 28 to 43. 2. Sigmund Freud, Herbert der Psychoanalyse, Outline of Psychoanalysis, Gesammeldwerke, 18 volumes, 17:75. All subsequent references to the collected works of Freud are taken from this edition. 3. Immanuel Kant, Metaphysikanfängsgrund der Tugendlehre, Die Metaphysik der Sitten, in 2 parts, 2-6. 4. Sigmund Freud, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, Civilization and its Discontents, Gesammeldwerke, 14-442. 5. Ibid, 14-455. 6. Ibid, 14-493. 7. Ibid, 14-492. 8. Ibid. 9. Sigmund Freud, Jenseits des Lustprinzips, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Gesammeldwerke, 1-345. 10. Sigmund Freud, Herbert der Psychoanalyse, Outline of Psychoanalysis, Gesammeldwerke, 17:71. 11. Sigmund Freud, Mass and Psychology and Psychoanalysis, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Gesammeldwerke, 13, 112. 12. Ibid, 13, 113. 13. See this text, pp. 28-43. 14. Sigmund Freud, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, Civilization and its Discontents, Gesammeldwerke, 14-492. 15. Ibid, 14-492 f. 16. Sigmund Freud, Civilization and its Discontents, p. 105. Chapter 2. Progress and Freud's Theory of Instincts. Let me begin by defining the two main types of the concept of progress that are characteristic of the modern period of Western culture. The first defines progress as a predominantly quantitative phenomenon and avoids